Let us get started. So, hi everyone. If you're joining us now or joining us after the break, we have Anna here with us, who's going to be talking about custom logging within Databricks.
Cool. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Awesome. Okay, custom logging within Databricks. First of all, who am I? So I'm a senior advancing analytics consultant. I specialise in data engineering and cloud. I've got over 15 years experience, most recently working with Microsoft data platforms, Scala, Kafka, and various cloud tech. Started off in software engineering, absolutely love data, so I've ended up going down the data engineering route and essentially becoming a consultant. I've got a Bachelor of Science in Multimedia Computing and a HND in Visual Communications. I'm quite heavily involved in the community, so I'm a co-organiser of Data Bristol, and I'm heavily involved in Women's Tech Hub in Bristol, trying to get more women into tech. So organising events, going to be writing some blogs and their new magazine as well. So definitely check it out, especially if you're a girl or if you know women in tech or women who want to get into tech. And I also get involved with some local co-clubs and stuff as well. So that's my sales pitch. Custom logging within Databricks. What are we going to do? So we're going to look at logging and why should we care. Then dive into some structured logging. Logging essentially are metrics within Azure, what we get out of the box. Logging metrics within Databricks, what we get out of the box. And then we'll have an actual real world demo. So something taken out of my day job, essentially. So logging, why should we care? So if I was in a room at the moment, I'd basically get everyone to put their hands up as to who's actually got into work, say 9 o'clock in the morning and immediately been pounced upon because an ETL pipeline has failed overnight. It took hours and hours to run, failed. We need the data. Your stakeholders are going crazy. You need to sort it out. You need to figure out what's going on. Anyone who's been there essentially will have been there digging into the processes, trying to dig into the logs, figure out what's going on. And that's essentially a perfect example of where logging comes into its own. Logging is commonplace in software engineering. So I've got a strong background in software engineering, and logging is essentially something that you just do. It's just there. You do it without thinking. We just have logging metrics. It's implemented in our solutions. But why is logging often overlooked when it comes to data engineering? So that's a question essentially we should be asking ourselves. And why aren't we bringing in these core concepts into our data engineering projects more often and more from day one, so right at the beginning of our greenfield projects? So often when I ask people about logging and why it's not implemented, they're just like, well, it's just for capturing and reacting to errors, right? So it's just something we can add in as an afterthought. Well, logging helps capture events in a linear order. It helps you trace back when errors occur. You can see how far your process has got to, including triggering events and subsequent paths taken. But most importantly, we can have the output of processes. We can track results, we can track counts, we can track timings. And these are all things that we can then utilize within our monitoring tools to actually monitor, essentially, for example, our ETL processes. And essentially, what that does is it helps you meet your SLAs, your service level agreements, and your SLOs, your service level objectives. So it's not just about capturing those errors, it's capturing all the information that you could potentially need within, for example, your ETL processes, your data engineering pipelines. Structured logging. So structured logging is essentially the practice of implementing a consistent predetermined message format from application logs that allow them to be treated as data sets rather than text. So if we take this example piece of code here, so we've just got log.log, we're saying it's information, so we're saying it's info. And then there's our log message. This is my log message. So that's just a piece of text, it's just a string. So that's great, we can push that into our logging systems, but it's not providing us a lot of information. It's still something if that message was a big message, we'd have to dig into it to try and figure out what's going on. Structured logging, on the other hand, if we look at this example here, is essentially we're putting our log into JSON and we're creating our own custom structured log types. So we still have our message. This is my log message. And then we're also essentially defining some additional additional properties within that JSON, within that piece of logging that we want to then put into our logging system. So we're also logging the process started as a custom log event. So we're going to have lots of different custom log events, and this one in particular is going to be a process that started, and then we're also capturing created app. Now this is just an example. The amount of stuff you can put in there is infinite, but these are two very common concepts and areas that you'd start off with. So you just start building up some custom log events, and you start putting some dates in there, and then you potentially move on to things like row counts and things that have and haven't completed. So how have I used this before in software engineering? So I've said that I've used logging a lot, and structured logging within my career as a software engineer. How exactly have I used it? So we've got our guy here, this is our user, and he basically wants to pay a bill. So whether that's a subscription, whether that's a utilities bill, he wants to go online onto the website and actually pay a bill. So there's a website, and then it hits the back end. Now, common misconception is it's just going to hit one service in the back end, and that'll be it, make the payment, and it comes back to him and says whether it's successful or failed. Well, actually, with large companies that I've worked for, it's more complex than that. So a system that I worked on, we essentially had a payment service, billing and statement service, customer service, notification service. And these are essentially all microservices in the background that are affected by this one transaction. And we want to log all of that information as it's happening. We want to define some structured logs so we can track what's going on. What can those structured logs be? For example, with the payment service, we could have payment received event, a payment rejected, a payment approved, time received, time processed, and essentially a fail to communicate. So what happens if we fail to communicate with that service? What happens if we're doing a load of retries in case that happens, but we want to actually log that we've on numerous occasions actually failed initially to communicate with that service? We want to tell the people who are responsible for that service that this keeps happening. Billing and statement service, say similarly, we're going to have bill requested, bill amended, where the amendment's been approved, time received, time processed, and again, the fail to communicate. Similarly with the customer service, customer info requested, customer info retrieved, customer not found, time received, time processed, fail to communicate. Notification service, so this is essentially sending out email notifications, SMS notifications. So a notification that an event triggered, notification that an email or SMS was sent. Once again, time received, time processed, failed to communicate. So how can we apply this to data engineering? So that's an example within the realms of software engineering. How can we apply this to one of our ETL pipelines or a load of ETL pipelines? So our user has mutated into a data engineer, and he's got a load of data sources, ALTP database, third-party REST API, blob storage, and essentially he's got a load of ETL batch pipelines that he is going to use to actually pull all of that data and then essentially put it into a data lake or a data lake house. What are some of the custom log events that we could create, our structured logs around this? So we can have things like row count, processed row count, failed row count, an invalid data type, for example. So if somebody's landed a file that's in the wrong format, for example, once again, time received, time processed, failed to communicate again. Okay, so that's logging and structured logging and why it's super useful. What do we get within the realms of Azure? So what do we get out of the box when we want to actually start working with this within our Azure ecosystem? So Azure offers us, let's have a drink, sorry. Azure essentially offers us Azure Monitor. Now, Azure Monitor is a suite of tools which basically gives you that functionality that you need to be able to store your logs and then actually react and report on them. So we've got insights, visualization, analysis, respond, which is like email response and SMS responses. And then you can also integrate into things like Event Hub, Logic Apps, and export APIs. So just to note, this isn't unique to Azure. So you can also have custom sources. So if you wanted to plug this into AWS and GCP and local data centers, you can. That is something you can do. So if somebody at your company argues that they want something that's cross-platform, essentially Azure Monitor does have those connectors available for you to be able to do that. So the log analytics workspace, so we're going to be focusing on the log analytics workspace, getting our logs in there, essentially what it can do for us, and how we can then integrate those logs within our Azure Monitor and actually do stuff with them. The log analytics workspace is essentially like a data warehouse of logs. And you use KQL, which is a query language, to essentially query those logs once you've got them in there. But within the log analytics workspace, you can also set up connectors to event hubs, which is great for event pipelines, and then also storage, which is essentially the original one, and it's great for long-term retention. Now, just quickly, this is a diagram of how the Azure Monitor alert workflow works. Now, this is where we will be able to actually set up a trigger to send out an email or send out an SMS message, or even send out a voice message as well. That is also an option which I haven't actually tried yet. So this is just an example of the workflow, essentially under the hood that happens that enables you to do that. And like I said, it's great for triggering emails, SMS, and running processes off the back of alerts. So, let's grab another drink here. Logging in Databricks. So that's what we get in Azure. We've talked about how and why logging is awesome. What do we get in Databricks? What do we already have for Databricks? Now, for Databricks, there are a load of tools that you can use already mostly for metrics, but also for logging. One really popular one is Grafana. And what I've provided at the bottom there, and I'll provide this at the end as well, is a link to some Microsoft documentation as to how you can actually hook Grafana up to log analytics and create yourself basically some dashboards, which is super useful. I am going to be writing a blog around that as well, and I'm going to be writing some blogs around all of this that I'm covering in this talk. So anything that doesn't make sense, if you want to dig more deeply into, I will in time be writing some blogs around it, and I already have, a Git repo with all of the code that I'm going to show you, which I'll provide the link to at the end as well. So we also have the tried and trusted Spark UI within Databricks. So this is what you get with any Spark implementation, Databricks implementation. You have the Spark UI that you can go to and start digging into and start looking at your metrics, looking at the logs that have come out from your events, from any failures, and you can dig in and start figuring out what's going on when things have gone wrong. And then, of course, we've got Azure Log Analytics, which we've already spoken about. Now, Azure Log Analytics out of the box, essentially, you can create a connection between your Databricks instance and your Log Analytics instance, and it will give you a load of metrics data out of the box. So it will create a series of tables, which you can see here on the right under Log Management, prefixed with Databricks, which will essentially give you a load of metrics data that you can start working with out of the box. So you can start attempting to create some dashboards or some alerting, or just start digging into and having a play around with. But what you don't get is you don't out of the box get custom logging, and that's what we're going to be digging into. So you don't get that functionality of being able to do that log.log info, .log error. That's something that that within this talk I'll demo to you how I've generated essentially a process to do that with some Python code. So to do that, essentially, we're going to work with the Log Analytics REST API. So I will provide this again at the end, as with any links that I've got in my slides. So this is a link to the REST API documentation. And what you essentially get with the REST API for Log Analytics is you are able to manage Log Analytics resources. You can send custom log data to Log Analytics, which is what we're going to do. And then you can access your logs and analytics data and essentially start analyzing it. So we are now going to dive into our real world demo. What exactly is this going to consist of? We're going to go through the setup of log analytics for Databricks. We're going to create a Python wheel containing log analytics REST API logic to create our logs. I'm going to write some custom logs via Databricks notebooks, explore our custom logs in log analytics, and create Azure monitor alerts for our custom logs. So to create the connector between your log analytics instance within Azure, so this is the Azure portal. To create that connection, you go to diagnostic settings, then you can filter by your subscription and your resource group. So I've set up my own little resource group here for this demo, so custom logging in Databricks. And within here, I started creating some resources. And you can see here we've got our Databricks instance. How do we connect that up to log analytics? Well, you can literally go into it, and then it takes ages to load. So bear with me a second. You can go to here and basically add a diagnostic setting. Now, as you can see, I've already created one. Here's one I made earlier. And this is essentially a diagnostic setting that's connecting my Databricks instance to log analytics. So if we go into the details of that, you can see I've told it to essentially log everything possible. So DBFS, clusters, accounts, jobs, notebooks, SSH, workspace, secrets, secret permissions, instance pools, everything possible. I want to push that into my log analytics instance. And this retention is essentially saying it's at 0 because it's essentially saying don't delete it. Retention is essentially there is no retention, just keep it infinitely. So you can essentially set that to whatever you like. So if you wanted to keep it as 12 months, 6 months, you can do. And then on the right hand side, we are simply specifying the subscription, the workspace. So that's our log analytics instance. And then I've also checked this archive to storage account. So this is where we can write all of this into blob storage, which is super useful for long-term retention. And you can also have other processes reading into that. So other logging tools. I haven't selected the event hub because that's outside the scope essentially of this demo. Okay, so now we are actually within log analytics itself. And so in here, you can see, so this is in the Azure portal, just going to our log analytics instance. In here, I've clicked on logs. We can see those tables that we saw in my slide deck in that screen grab. So we've got all of our Databricks tables here, and that's all our metrics information. But what we're interested in is this custom logs. So these are essentially some custom logs that I've already created. And when I created them, it's essentially created me these custom log tables. So no imagination, my custom logs _ error, and then my custom logs _ info. So how do we query this? Well, essentially using KQL, we can start building up our queries here. So I'm doing a very simple query of the info table where my log type is got data log event. So if we were to then open this up, we can see that log type property there. Where has that come from? That has come from me defining that in my JSON and my custom log. I've said I'm going to have a property called log type, and essentially it's inferred it as being a string because that's what I've provided. And so because it's then recognized that as its own property within its own right, I'm then able to essentially query on it. So if you run this query again, you'll see some logs that I essentially generated earlier. And in here, you can see that log type there again, but then we've also got other custom properties that I've added in. So that who's there, that's something that I added. Our message, so that would be our big beefy message if it is a massive message that we can put in there. So we can still push out all of our error information from a try catch, for example, but we can just enrich it with all this useful information. So yeah, we've also got like row count, applications. So that's the name of the actual notebook that we're going to be working with. So yeah, super useful stuff. You can see it in log analytics. What do we do if we want to actually put this into a dashboard? I just want to say at this phase, I'm going to show you the code and everything, but I'm just illustrating to you what it looks like within log analytics first, the end result, and then we'll dive into and look at what the code looks like and what it looks like in the notebook where I'm generating those logs. So what we can literally do a pin to dashboard here. It gives us the option of private and shared. We just stick to private for now. Let's go to that. That shows on the dashboard here. So what you can see here is this one at the bottom here. That's one I made earlier. This one here is what it's just pinned to our dashboard. So this is my own private dashboard that once I'm happy with it, I can then publish it, share it with other people in the team, share it with stakeholders. In some companies I've worked with, when we've generated dashboards like this, we've actually put them on a big screen in the office so that we can constantly monitor our applications, especially when you're working with structured logging, so you can look at timings and row counts and things. And essentially what it's done is it's created me this analytics cell here. And if we go into some of these buttons here, we can see what we can do to customize it. So we can change our title, change our subtitle, can change our query. And you can select whether you want your results to be, as we're seeing it here, so just listed, or we can actually change that to be a chart. We should bring that down. Yeah. So we can click on and say, right, we want to actually this to actually be a chart, and that's what you can see there, what I've already been fiddling with. And then we can actually start fiddling with the chart itself. We can change it from a column to a variety of other options like line chart, scatter, pie, donut. And then we can change the x-axis and the y-axis, so we can select basically our structured logging properties here. So we've got our row count essentially as one of my structured logging properties that I've defined, so I can select that and start using that to generate my charts. And it could essentially just be a count. If you just wanted to do a count on rows, you could just create a cell for that as well. It doesn't have to be charts. But this is just a nice example to get going. And here in this top one, you can see I've basically defined it via row count and time generated. And so I've been running this intermittently today. So you can see some bars here essentially indicating what the row count is and essentially when it was ran. So that's the dashboard, and that's a very, very beginner demo dashboard. You can make this wonderful, weird and wonderful, put lots of stuff in there, start adding your metrics in there as well. So really powerful and really great to share with other people within the company as well. What do we want to do essentially if we want to now alert? So going into Azure Monitor, so this is what we were talking about, that suite of tools that we can use to basically work with our logs and our metrics. So I've just gone into the Azure portal and opened up Azure Monitor, and in here, you can see you've got this logs button here, and that will literally take you to what we were just looking at. That will take you to log analytics. What we're interested in is how can we set up alerts. So if we go into alerts here, you can see we've got informational here, and that's because I've already got some set up. So that's telling us what has been running, what's been triggered. We go to manage our alerts. Now it's these top two here that we're interested in. These are the two that I've set up. So I've set up an excessive number of ETL processes running and a wrong file data type. So if we just go into the top one first, so essentially defining what the log analytics instances that we're going to be working with, and then we've defined a query. So essentially, as you can see, we've got the same sort of query as what we were just looking at within log analytics. So I've essentially defined a query as to what I want to actually alert on. So I want to say when we've got a get data logging event, structured logging type. And then I want to essentially, when the number of counts of instances of that log is greater than 10. Now in the real world, that would actually be higher, obviously. We're not bothered if there's 10 ETL processes running, but in the real world, if that actually becomes quite large, it is something that you could, for example, monitor. So if this went up to like 1,000, we could then send an email alert out to the relevant people to say, we've got a lot of ETL processes running at the moment, might want to check that out and make sure that nothing's throttling, and just make sure that there's nothing running exceptionally slow. And essentially, we've got a period at the bottom here. So this is just how many times have we had that message in the last 5 minutes. So we don't care if it's happened, say in the last 24 hours, that's normal. But if in the last 5 minutes we've got a massive count, then essentially we want to react to that. So what does it look like when we actually get an email alert from that? So this is essentially what we get. This is something I triggered earlier. You can see our query again that we we're just looking at. It provides you with loads of useful information, so some of our structured logging information again. And what I find super useful is an actual link to log analytics to then start digging into those processes and start figuring out what's going on. So it'll view all the 204 results for that particular query, but you can then start building on it. So then we've also got this wrong file data type as well. Very similar to the last alert, we've got a query set up here. Very similar, just looking for a particular structured log type of wrong data type log event. But with this one, is actually saying the threshold is if I get any messages at all. So if it's above 0, essentially we've hit a wrong data type and we need to react to that straight away. So this is an alert that's essentially marked as an error that we'd email out, we send an SMS. You could set this up to also trigger to send to a Teams channel or a Slack channel if you wanted to. You can set it up to trigger, say, an Azure function or logic apps. So the possibilities are infinite, what you can actually do as a reaction to this event. But again, this is essentially going to trigger if we get more than one of these within the last 5-minute period. Okay, so we've looked at the dashboard, we've looked at the alerts that have been set up. How exactly have I set that up? How have I actually triggered those? How have I actually triggered those logs? Well, this is a notebook that we're going to be working with, and this is working with some code that I've put together and put into a Python wheel. Now, a Python wheel, for those who aren't aware, is essentially a library within Python. So it's a way of packaging up your code into a library that you can then push into essentially whatever system you're working with. And in this context, we are working with Databricks. So let's dive into that code. So here we moved over to Visual Studio Code. And I have a series of Python scripts which I have built up to enable us to be able to write those logs into log analytics and essentially then start to react on them. So this is all working, as mentioned, with the REST API. So to start with, we've just got this post logs, and this is literally doing as it says on the tin. I'm just going to check the time. This is essentially doing as it says on the tin. This is literally just posting some logs. So this is our base level of functionality, with which the rest of the functionality essentially builds on top of. So this is essentially communicating directly with the REST API, and all of the functionality within this wheel essentially uses this to be able to write the logs. So once we've got that set up, and we've also got like this build signature as well, which is security, which I won't dig into at this phase, but as mentioned, I'm going to write some blogging around this. So if you are interested, you can grab it from GitHub, and I will be writing some blogs around all of this. So once we're actually logging into log analytics, we want to actually have more functionality than that. We want to actually define whether it's information, whether it's error, whether it's just a warning, and then we want to start working with structured logging. So we then have this custom logging.py, and essentially in here, what we are doing is we've got a series of functions. We've got a log info, log error, log warning, log critical, and these are all essentially building up your log information. So it's taking a message, enriching it with application, cluster ID, session ID, who wrote it, and we saw that in our log analytics, and then the message itself. And then we're pushing it into this base log info, which essentially is utilizing, and that's that Python file there, and that's essentially utilizing this post log.py. So this is enriching our log message with loads of useful information and effectively turning it into a structured log. And this is using, for those familiar with Databricks, this is essentially using dbutils and pulling loads of useful information using dbutils. So we're getting information about the notebook, we're getting information about the cluster and the session and the current user. And then we're then able to put that into our log so that we can then work with that. So this is great, but we want to actually add our own additional structured logging into this. So we want that actual log type that we were seeing. We want to add in things like our row counts. How do we do that? So essentially, all this is it's JSON. So all we need to do, and what we've got here, is to create some more functionality, which is essentially going to take, as well as the message, some structured logs, some structured log information. So in that structured log information, we are going to have some JSON, which is going to have all of that data that we're interested in. So then we're taking all that base information that we're already using to enrich our logs, and then adding in whatever structured logs we've piped in. So this is essentially dynamic. So we can put in there whatever we like. So we're taking that information and then we're concatenating it all together. We're building up our JSON object. And again, we're then going to our base log methods, which will work with that post log underscore log to essentially write this to log analytics using our REST API. So essentially, this is the wheel that we've put together. And what makes this the wheel is our setup.py. So in setup.py, we've got all of our useful information that basically defines what the name is, what the version is, who the author is. So all of that useful information that again then gets packaged up within your wheel, and we basically run a Python command against this setup.py to create that wheel. So going back into our notebook is essentially utilizing that wheel. So I have created that wheel manually and then manually uploaded that into Databricks. So if we were to go into our clusters, go into our libraries, you can see here, this is the wheel that I've generated from that code. And in this instance, I've manually installed it because this is a demo, into our Databricks instance. And we can then go into our notebook. And you can see here right at the top, we're importing the namespace essentially of that wheel that I've created. So we've called our wheel this, and then we have .utils.custom logs. So that reflects the file folder structure that we were just looking at within that code. And we're naming it custom logs, and then we're also grabbing our structured logging code. So we've named that structured logs. And then what I'm doing is essentially I'm going through and I'm setting up a load of basically just some demo logs that we can, as we've already seen, them work with to actually start building up dashboards and alerts. So we have custom logging here, .log info. As you can see, we're just passing in a string. So just a message, because as we've discussed, this is just out of the box, just throw some text in there. So that could be a massive log error, just throw it in there. And that is essentially enabling you to do that. So that's without the additional structured logging. But it will, as we saw, enrich it with additional useful information like the name of the notebook and the session ID, the name of the person who actually instigated this. And then we've got an example of our structured logging. So that log info takes the message as well, but then here is where we've got some actual JSON that we're parsing in, and that's where we've got our log type. And that's where I've just defined a getting data log event. And now for demo purposes, whenever this runs, I've got it printing out essentially for the structured logging what it's actually compiled together for the structured log. So this essentially is our JSON. When it gets this message, when it gets this snippet of JSON here, this is what it's actually creating. So it's got the application, the cluster ID, the session ID, the who, so that's me, the message, but then we've also got this log type. So as we defined here, we're adding in a log type property. We can see here it's added it in there into our JSON, and this will, as I keep saying, get them pushed into log analytics. So because I was being a little bit, not lazy, but I wanted to keep this simple, I am using what Databricks give you out of the box when it comes to data sets. So they give you a load of sample data sets that you can work with to get going in Databricks. So that is literally in this Databricks datasets file path. So what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing some of their sample data to actually then start writing some logs into the database based on the data that we're working with. So I'm using dbutils again. This is the data. I'm just investigating what the data looks like. So I'm working with a CSV file. And then initially I'm setting up what's today's date, because I want to push a date into there. And then we're doing a bit of structured logging. So once again, I've just put working in as a message, but like I said, that could be an elaborate, massive piece of text if you wanted it to be. And then we've got a structured log, a log type, and then getting data log event, a process ID, super useful if you're doing this across applications, so not just within the context of Databricks. If you're constantly parsing through your process ID, you're then able to trace your logs across applications. So process ID, super useful, and then also a time started. And then we're doing basically basically creating a data frame from that data set we're looking at. So we're just going to do a simple spark.read, tell it it's going to be CSV, tell it to include the header, grab that data, and I'm doing a dataframe.show to force an actual action, because transformations and actions within Databricks, we want to force it to actually grab that data, go away and do that processing. And then we're doing a structured log again to literally just say got data log event. So I'm getting my data, I've got my data, and then I'm passing in again the process ID, the row count this time, which is super useful. So we're actually looking to see how many rows did we get from that data, and then pushing that into our logs so we can monitor and see, for example, if we're getting particularly large amounts of data in particular files, and we can actually react to that with our within our alerts. We can react to it within our dashboards. We can have something kind of flash up and highlight red when something is actually higher than a certain count. Once again, we've got our time started. So what's useful to note, and I just remembered I forgot to show you this, which is like super useful. When we're looking at our, for example, our row count and our process ID, it's got a data type next to it of real. Now that's not something that I've told it to do. It's basically looked at the data that we've given it, and it's basically inferred that that's the data type I'm going to give it. So out the box, it's going to say it's a string, because in those instances, I was giving it text. But in this instance, it's recognized that process ID is always numeric, so it's given as a type of real. Now you can work on that, and especially with like dates and things, and make sure that it infers the correct type. So if it doesn't quite get it right, you can work on that and make sure it is inferring it correctly. But it's nice that just out of the box, it's done that for us. And it also makes it super useful when we're doing reporting and alerting, when we're working with counts and things and dates. So yeah, so that's our happy path, essentially. So we're looking at some happy path scenarios here. So we're getting data, we've read our data, great, we've got a row count. What happens when we want to actually record an error? And that's where we were looking at that wrong data type event. So here I'm looking at a different data set, and what I'm deliberately doing and what I'm deliberately going to show you now is that I'm deliberately giving it the wrong data type for what I'm trying to read, so that I can then force it to error, which is why I've got this try catch around this code. Force it to error and force it to basically write one of those wrong data type log events, and that essentially will then trigger that alert. So I've got a very simple try except. Obviously in the real world, we would have accepting lots of different scenarios. So we'd have lots of different exception types, and we'd build this up so that we can make it as robust as possible. But for simplicity, for this demonstration, I've just got a very simple try except, because I know it's going to fail, because I've essentially given it the wrong data type deliberately. So here you can see, once again, we're doing a structured log, get data log event, as you saw above. But then here, it's doing essentially a wrong data type because it's failed, and that then writes into log analytics. And again, we can see the JSON that it's generating below here. So we can see those two bits of JSON from when it was getting the data and from when it failed. And we can see our log types there. So what I've also done in this notebook, and again, this will be available in GitHub for anyone who wants to have a play around with it, which is also why it's super useful to use the Databricks data sets out of the box. So I'm not asking you to attempt to try and connect to a data lake or anything. You can literally, hopefully, just run this as soon as you've got the wheel installed. So what I'm doing here is literally, I'm just saying write like 100 instances of this log message. And this was literally just so I could show you that first alert message that is reacting on the number of these logs being higher than 10. So I'm just pushing in a load of logs into the database just to prove that our alert works. So yeah, so that's essentially it. So we've got a wheel and we've got a notebook here that's basically testing that wheel logic, which, like I said, you guys can pick up after this and have a play around with. Okay. Okay, so useful links, that is the actual repository, that's where all my code is. So you'll find a copy of the slide deck as well there. And then just some useful Microsoft links to get started with log analytics, the log analytics REST API, and as mentioned before, Grafana as well. So metrics and monitoring within log analytics. So thank you very much for coming to my talk. It's been a pleasure. I hope it's all made sense. And haven't rushed over some of the bits too quickly, especially when it comes to like wheels and things. Those are my social media links, and please just message me if you have any questions or if you just want to connect. Yeah, just give me a shout.
Thanks, Anna. That was great. We're a bit quiet in the chat. Does anyone have any questions? Means you did a stellar job. Just checking YouTube to see if there's anything. Don't think so.
I'm just sorry that the costumes dropped off a little bit. I was very, very hot.
I'm wearing my Advancing Analytics hoodie, but I'm getting really hot in it, so I was considering taking it off. I'm branded.
Well, okay, so if there's no questions, I'm going to switch to my screen for a second. So before we go on to that, so yeah, thanks to John and Anna. Can you all see my screen even? Awesome. So there is a competition for feedback. So you could win yourself a drone. So I'm gonna pop this in the chat. And I see a comment in the chat. Oh, we do have a question. What's the view on logging in, is it Apache, Spark pools in Azure, Synapse, and Analytics? Is it similar, better, or worse?
It's not something that I've dug into yet. It's a good question. It'd be nice as soon as I do. That's something that I'd like to blog about and talk about. So
there's just another one in the Q&A as well. It's from Peter. What is the cheapest way to get started with Databricks? Can you create a container in Docker locally with the runtime?
It's quite, I'd say if you want to set it up from scratch, Databricks, it's a little bit painful. I definitely recommend if you can get some free credits in Azure or in any of the other providers, so you can get Databricks in GCP and AWS, is to actually use it there, because you can literally spin it up at the push of a button.
I think Community Edition's all right as well. Sorry, Anna.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, there's Community Edition as well, which I think is the way I got going with it. Yeah, it doesn't take a lot of Azure credits to get a small runtime running with like a smallish cluster on.
Yeah, I think that you can get it's free of charge.
Yeah.
There's another question here from Daniel saying, Anna, great talk. How much of what you showed can be deployed with Terraform?
So are we talking about deploying Databricks itself, or the wheel, or the notebook, or actually log analytics and Azure Monitor? You can certainly get ARM templates for Azure Monitor and your alerts. You can certainly do that. I haven't dug into yet what you can do with Terraform.
Cool. Thanks, Anna. Any other questions in the chat? Oh, we've got another one. They're all flying in now. Can you get which user is running a notebook or accessing a table, even if the lake is mounted via service principal? It's an interesting one.
Certainly with the context of a notebook, it's going to grab whatever's running that notebook. So if it's not a user running the notebook, then it's going to identify it as being the service principal. Because it's essentially all it's doing is going away and grabbing whatever's running it. So yeah. Does that answer the question?
Does that answer the question, Richie? Yep. Thank you. And we've got a comment from Cameron saying there is now a Databricks provider for Terraform, which is rapidly evolving.
Nice.
Awesome. Just give it a minute, just see if any other questions pop in. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna go back to the slide for a second. So yeah, there's a drone. I've popped it in the chat. Maybe it got a bit lost there with all the questions, but you should be able to use that. There is a deadline, so we do want kind of responses and feedback by 10 a.m. tomorrow. So you can go in and select the speaker. You can also go in and kind of add comments on how you found this platform or anything for us at Data Relay as well. And tomorrow, as you know, we have a whole schedule of events. We're at Mercia. We have Laura presenting on Brilliant Report, Can I Print It? And we've got Aaron doing a session on the Azure SQL database. So do come along to that if you're interested. Thank you all for joining us. Any last words from Anna, Arthur, or John?
Very much for having me. And no, thanks, Anna.
Thank
that was
you.
A great session.
Yeah, thank you so much. I learned so much in that. That was really good, really engaging. I know it's hard with these online sessions.
Yeah, I'm always looking for feedback for my sessions, ways to improve. So if anything wasn't clear, please let me know.
Thanks, guys. It looks like
we're
getting lots of positive feedback already in the chat. So thanks for your time tonight, guys. Really appreciate it.
No worries.
Thank you. Not a problem.
All the best
so much.
For the rest of the events.
Thank you. Gonna figure out how to stop this live on YouTube. I guess I just click the button and say stop live stream. Should I click it?
I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, I'm clicking it.
Click it. You have the power.
I guess and then it's stop recording. Don't want to stop.